Money buys loyalty, fear buys silence, but neither could buy De Juan a bride who would walk down the aisle. He sat at the altar, a ruthless king confined to a chrome wheelchair, while 600 elite guests whispered their pity. When the cathedral doors stayed firmly shut, his empire teetered on the edge of utter humiliation. But from the shadows of the catering staff stepped a girl in a cheap uniform. She didn't offer pity. She offered a dance. Sunlight angled heavily through the stained glass of St. Jude's Cathedral painting, harsh, bruised streaks across the cold marble floor. De Juan Marshall adjusted his grip on the armrests of his wheelchair. The titanium was freezing against his palms. It was a grounding sensation, sharp and real, cutting through the heavy, suffocating scent of 10,000 white lilies. He hated lilies. They smelled like funerals. Today they were supposed to smell like a wedding. Behind his back, 600 people sat trapped in a silence so thick it pressed against the eardrums. On the left side of the aisle sat the Marshall Syndicate capos in tailored suits. Soldiers with concealed firearms, men who killed on his command without blinking. On the right side sat the Rossi family, smug, restless, checking their platinum watches. This wedding was a treaty, a merger of territories and bloodlines, meant to be sealed with a gold band and a hollow vow. It had been 45 minutes. De Juan didn't need to turn his head to know Camilla Rossi wasn't coming. The absence of the bride had shifted from a slight delay to an agonizing, undeniable reality. He could feel the eyes boring into the back of his neck. They weren't looking at De Juan the boss, the man who had ordered the execution of 3 rival lieutenants from a hospital bed 2 years ago. They were looking at De Juan the cripple, the paralyzed half-man whose own fiancée couldn't stomach the thought of wheeling him through life. A bullet to the lower spine had taken his legs. Today, Camilla's absence was threatening to take his authority. In his world, weakness was a death sentence. Pity was the executioner's axe. Boss. Leo, his underboss, stepped up to the altar. The older man's face was a mask of rigid calm, but the slight sheen of sweat on his forehead betrayed the panic underneath. Leo leaned down, pretending to adjust the microphone stand. "Her father's making calls," Leo murmured, his voice barely a rasp. She slipped out the back of the dressing room at the hotel. Took a car. "She's gone, Dom." De Juan's jaw ticked. A muscle twitched right below his cheekbone. He looked straight ahead at the crucifix hanging above the altar. A dying man nailed to wood. Fitting. "Tell the priest to wrap it up," De Juan said. His voice was entirely flat, devoid of the rage Leo clearly expected. "Dom, we need to get you out of here through the sacristy. Avoid the crowd. Let the Rossis deal with the fallout of their daughter's disrespect." "No." De Juan finally turned his head, locking eyes with his second-in-command. His gaze was dead, hollowed out. "If I scurry out the back door, I prove them right. I prove I am exactly what she thought I was. A broken thing to be hidden away." In the alcove near the choir stalls, Nadine Walker shifted her weight from her left foot to her right. Her cheap black catering shoes pinched at the toes. She was holding a silver tray loaded with flutes of champagne that were slowly growing warm. She had been standing there for an hour, invisible, a ghost in a white button-down shirt and a black apron. She watched the man in the wheelchair. She didn't know the politics of the families. She didn't care about the millions of dollars represented by the silk suits and diamond necklaces in the pews. She cared about the $200 she was getting paid for this double-shift money that would keep her landlord from turning off the heat in her apartment. But Nadine had eyes, and she knew what humiliation looked like. She had seen it in her mother's eyes at the welfare office. She had seen it in her own reflection when she had to beg a professor for an extension she didn't deserve. She watched de Juan Marshall smoothly rotate his chair to face the congregation. He didn't look angry. He looked like a statue carved from ice. The murmurs in the cathedral instantly died. 600 pairs of eyes snapped to the altar. De Juan reached up and casually unbuttoned the top button of his suit jacket. It appears, de Juan's voice boomed through the church's acoustics, smooth and unbothered, that the bride has decided to forfeit her position. The merger between our families will be renegotiated. The reception, however, is fully catered. He let a thin, razor-sharp smile touch his lips. I paid a fortune for the caviar. I expect to see every single one of you there to eat it. Good afternoon. He didn't wait for a response. He gripped the joystick of his chair, the electric motor whining softly in the dead silence, and rolled straight down the center aisle. The guests parted like the Red Sea. Nobody breathed. Nobody offered a word of sympathy. They just watched the paralyzed king retreat, projecting an armor of pure arrogance that everyone knew was cracking down the middle. Nadine adjusted her grip on her tray. God, she thought. What a nightmare. The grand ballroom of the Marshall estate was a masterclass in suffocating extravagance. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling, catching the light and throwing prisms across the walls. A 5-tier cake, iced in stark white and gold leaf, sat untouched in the corner like a monument to a dead civilization. The air was dense with the smell of roasted meats, spilled gin, and nervous perspiration. De Juan sat at the head table. Alone. They had removed the bride's chair. It was a subtle gesture by his staff, meant to be kind, but it only amplified the empty space to his right. The room was full. None of the guests had dared to disobey his final order at the church, but a massive, invisible perimeter had been drawn around the head table. People stood in tight, anxious clusters, drinking heavily and speaking in hushed, urgent tones. The Rossi family had huddled near the east exit, looking like hostages. The Marshall capos were drinking aggressively, throwing dirty looks across the room. De Juan held a lowball glass of scotch. He hadn't touched the food on his plate. He sat perfectly straight, his broad shoulders squared, his tailored tuxedo jacket immaculate. He was playing the part. He was projecting absolute authority. But from where Nadine was standing, wiping down an abandoned cocktail table near the bandstand, she saw the truth. She saw the way his knuckles were white around the glass. She saw the minute tremor in his jaw. She saw a man bleeding out in front of a crowd, refusing to ask for a tourniquet. Table 4 needs clearing. A sharp voice snapped behind her. It was the catering manager, a stressed-out man with a headset and a permanent scowl. And take a fresh bottle of Macallan to the head table. Nadine blinked. To him? Yes, to him. Do your job, Walker, and don't look him in the eye. The guy's liable to shoot someone just to break the tension. Nadine grabbed a fresh bottle of scotch from the service bar. She smoothed her apron, took a deep breath, and began the long walk across the ballroom floor. The silence around the head table was oppressive. As Nadine approached, she felt the sheer weight of De Juan's isolation. Up close, he was striking. Sharp jawline, dark hair swept back, shadows carved deep under his eyes. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who had been fighting a war long before today. Nadine stopped at his table. She placed the bottle down quietly. She didn't scurry away. She reached for his empty water glass to refill it. "Leave it," De Juan rasped. His voice was low, gravelly, and scraped raw. Nadine paused, the water pitcher hovering. She looked down at him. The catering manager had told her not to look him in the eye, but Nadine had spent her whole life looking away from people who thought they were better than her. Today she just felt profoundly tired. "It's just water," she said, her voice entirely flat. No tremble, no deference, just a simple, grounded statement. De Juan's head snapped up. his eyes a startling, piercing shade of dark hazel locked onto hers. He looked genuinely taken aback, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly spoken to him. He was used to terror. He was used to sycophants. He wasn't used to a bored caterer defying a direct command over hydration. I said, De Juan repeated his tone, dropping a dangerous octave. "Leave it, and I'm getting paid to pour it," Nadine replied, pouring a steady stream into the crystal glass. "If I don't," my manager yells at me. "I've had a long day. You've had a bad day. Let's not make it worse for either of us." She set the pitcher down. For a second, the air between them vanished. De Juan stared at her, waiting for the apology, waiting for the sudden realization of who she was talking to. Nadine just wiped a condensation ring off the table with her rag. A loud, abrupt burst of laughter echoed from the Rossi side of the room. It was Camilla's cousin, heavily intoxicated, joking with a friend. The sound cut through the ballroom like a knife. De Juan's spine stiffened. His hand clamped down on the armrest of his wheelchair so hard, the leather groaned. He closed his eyes just for a fraction of a second, but Nadine caught it. It was a look of profound, agonizing defeat. He couldn't kill them all. He couldn't force respect. He was paralyzed, his bride had fled, and his enemies were laughing in his own house. He was drowning. Nadine finished wiping the table. She should have walked away. The smart thing to do was to fade back into the wallpaper, collect her minimum wage, and take the night bus home to her leaky apartment. Instead, she looked at the jazz band in the corner. They were awkwardly tuning their instruments, completely unsure if they should play the set list meant for a wedding reception. Nadine turned back to De Juan. "They're waiting for you," she said quietly. De Juan opened his eyes, glaring at her with a mix of fury and exhaustion. "Who?" "The band. The guests." Nadine nodded toward the dance floor. "It's a wedding reception. The first dance is on the schedule. If you sit here all night glaring at a glass of scotch, they win. They get to keep laughing." De Juan's expression darkened into something truly lethal. "I am in a wheelchair," he said, his voice, a lethal quiet, hiss meant only for her. "My bride is currently halfway to the border. I suggest you take your tray and get out of my sight before I have my men throw you out." Nadine didn't flinch. She set her rag down on her tray. "I know you're in a wheelchair," she said, gently stripping away the sarcasm. She looked at him, really looked at him. Past the expensive suit, past the terrifying reputation, straight to the wounded pride. "But you're not dead. And if you let them pity you tonight, you'll never get the stench of it out of this room." De Juan stared at her. The anger in his chest was suddenly warring with a bizarre, startling sense of clarity. Who the hell was this girl? She smelled like cheap soap and stale banquet coffee, yet she was standing in the kill zone of a Mafia boss, entirely unfazed. Nadine stepped around the table. She walked right into the open space where Camilla's chair should have been. She stopped squarely in front of him. She held out her hand, small, bare, the nails clipped short. "Shall we dance?" The bandleader, an elderly man holding a saxophone, caught sight of the movement at the head table. Desperate for any direction to break the awful tension in the room, he gave a frantic nod to the pianist. A slow, hauntingly smooth, jazz melody drifted through the speakers. It was soft melancholy, and deeply out of place for a celebration, yet perfect for the wreckage of the evening. De Juan looked at the small, calloused hand hovering in front of him. Then he looked up at Nadine's face. "You have absolutely no idea what you are doing," he murmured, his voice tight. "I know how to keep a beat," Nadine replied. "And I know that right now every single person in this room is waiting for you to break. Don't give them the satisfaction." De Juan's jaw clenched. The absurdity of it was staggering. De Juan Marshall, head of the most vicious crime syndicate on the coast, sharing a first dance with a minimum-wage catering maid. If he did this, it was a profound break from protocol. It was madness. But as another muted chuckle drifted from the Rossi side of the ballroom, madness suddenly felt like the only viable strategy. Slowly, deliberately, De Juan lifted his right hand. He placed it in hers. Her skin was warm. It wasn't soft, like the women he usually associated with it, was rough at the edges, practical. She didn't try to pull him. She simply gripped his hand firmly, an anchor in the storm. With his left hand, De Juan engaged the joystick of his chair. He rolled out from behind the head table. The reaction was instantaneous. The low hum of conversation in the ballroom died entirely. The clinking of glasses ceased. 600 heads turned as one watching in absolute stunned bewilderment as the boss moved toward the center of the polished oak dance floor, his hand held by a girl in a catering apron. They reached the center. The spotlight, operated by a very confused lighting technician, swung over and bathed them in a pool of stark white light. "How does this work?" Nadine asked, her voice, low audible only to him over the slow brush of the snare drum. "I don't know." De Juan admitted the words tasting strange on his tongue. He hadn't admitted a lack of knowledge to anyone in years. "I haven't danced since. Before." "Then we improvise." Nadine took a half step closer. She couldn't put her arms around his neck without making him bend awkwardly, so she didn't try. She kept his right hand securely in hers, holding it waist-high. She took her left hand and placed it gently on the broad, solid line of his shoulder. De Juan let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He shifted his left hand from the joystick, letting the chair idle, and placed his palm against her waist. He could feel the cheap cotton of her uniform, the stiff tie of the apron. Beneath it she was tense, but steady. They began to move. Nadine stepped slowly to the slow, dragging rhythm of the bass. One step back, one step to the side. De Juan matched her his left hand, returning to the joystick just long enough to rotate the chair in a smooth, synchronized pivot, then back to her waist. It wasn't a traditional waltz. It was a strange mechanical rotation, a push and pull between flesh and titanium. But it worked. Step, pivot, glide. De Juan kept his eyes locked on her face. He expected to see fear now that they were in the center of the room, the focal point of hundreds of armed and dangerous men. But Nadine was just looking at his shoulder, her brow slightly furrowed in concentration, biting her bottom lip as she counted the beat. "You're stiff," she whispered. "I have a severed spinal cord." He shot back dryly. "I mean your shoulders. You're bracing for an impact. Relax. Nobody is shooting at you. You clearly don't know my guests." A short, sharp laugh escaped her. It was a genuine soundbite and entirely unscripted. The sound hit De Juan squarely in the chest. It was the first real thing he had heard all day. As they rotated, De Juan's line of sight swept over the crowd. He saw Leo, his underboss, standing by the bar with his mouth slightly open. He saw the Rossi patriarch, his face turning a dangerous shade of red at the sheer audacity of the display. They weren't looking at De Juan with pity anymore. They were looking at him with deep, unsettled confusion. He had taken the narrative of his own humiliation and shattered it into pieces. He looked back at Nadine. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice losing some of its gravel, smoothing out into something dangerously soft. "Nadine. Nadine Walker." "You're going to get fired for this, Nadine Walker." "I know," she said, stepping smoothly backward as he rolled forward. "But the catering company is terrible anyway. The uniform is mostly polyester." A ghost of a smile, a real one. Not the razor-sharp baring of teeth he usually employed, touched the corner of De Juan's mouth. "Why did you do this?" he asked, his tone dropping the armor completely for a fraction of a second. "You don't know me. I am not a good man. People cross the street when they see me coming. Why would you step into the middle of this?" Nadine looked up from his shoulder, meeting his intense, hazel eyes. The harsh overhead spotlight cast deep shadows across her face, highlighting the exhaustion, but also a fierce, quiet dignity. "Because I know what it feels like to sit in a room full of people and wish the floor would open up and swallow you whole," she said quietly, her voice devoid of any dramatic flair, just raw honesty. "And I know that sometimes you just need someone to stand next to you, so you don't have to be the only freak in the room." De Juan's hand tightened marginally on her waist. The music swelled a tragic, beautiful crescendo of horns and piano. He didn't pull her closer. The chair made that impossible, but the space between them seemed to shrink violently. The hundreds of watching eyes faded into a blur of meaningless background static. For the first time in 2 years, De Juan Marshall didn't feel the phantom ache in his dead legs. He only felt the rhythm, the solid grounding reality of the girl in the cheap polyester uniform who had walked into a den of wolves and asked the alpha to dance. The song ended with a slow fade of the cymbals. Nadine stopped. De Juan halted the chair. They stood there in the center of the silent ballroom, still holding hands. The silence stretched thick and heavy. Then slowly from the corner of the room where the martial soldiers stood, someone began to clap. A slow, respectful applause. It was Leo. Within seconds, the rest of De Juan's men joined in. The Rossi family remained stubbornly silent, but the power dynamic in the room had irreversibly shifted. The pity was dead. The boss was still the boss. Nadine let go of his hand. She stepped back, her hands returning to her sides. The moment the connection broke, a sudden cold wave of reality crashed back over her. She was a maid. He was a mob boss. The music was over. "Good luck with your war, Mr. Marshall," she whispered, giving him a brief, almost imperceptible nod. Before he could say another word, she turned around, walked off the dance floor, grabbed her empty silver tray from the nearby table, and disappeared through the swinging doors of the kitchen. De Juan sat in the center of the room. He looked at his empty right hand. The warmth of her skin was already fading, but the impact of her defiance was burning a hole straight through his chest. Leo approached him quickly, his face a mix of relief and intense curiosity. "Dom, that was brilliant. It threw the Rossis completely off balance. They look like idiots." De Juan didn't look at his underboss. He kept his eyes fixed on the swinging kitchen doors. "Leo, De Juan," said his voice, cold sharp and newly alive. "Yeah, boss. Find out who runs that catering company." De Juan engaged his wheelchair, turning it slowly to face his empire. "Buy it, and bring Nadine Walker to my office tomorrow morning." Morning in Nadine's apartment always smelled like damp brick and burnt toast. She sat at a wobbly Formica table, staring at a final notice from the gas company. The paper was bright pink, a cheerful, violently neon pink that felt like a personal insult, considering it meant she would be taking cold showers by Tuesday. She rubbed her eyes. Her feet still throbbed from the cheap shoes she wore at the reception the night before. Her phone buzzed against the table, vibrating loudly against the cheap wood. She glanced at the screen. It was Gary, the catering manager. Nadine sighed, bracing herself. She hit accept. "Gary, look, I know I broke protocol." "Pack your uniform in a bag," Gary's voice interrupted. He sounded strange, not angry, terrified. "Leave it on your porch. You don't work for me anymore." Nadine's stomach plummeted. "Gary, please. I need this job. I'll do the midnight shifts in the dish pit. I don't care." You don't understand, Walker. Gary hissed the audio, crackling with his ragged breathing. I don't own the company anymore. It was bought out at 4 a.m., a shell corporation out of Delaware. 3 guys in suits showed up at my house while my kids were eating cereal and handed me a cashier's check. They told me to fire you. Nadine froze. The damp chill of the kitchen suddenly felt a lot colder. Who bought it? I don't ask questions from men who carry guns inside their jackets, Gary said bitterly. Look out your window. Good luck, Nadine. The line went dead. Nadine lowered the phone. She stood up, her bare feet silent on the cold linoleum, and walked to the single window overlooking the narrow alleyway of her building. A matte black Cadillac Escalade was idling by the curb. It took up the entire width of the street. 2 men in dark suits stood by the hood. They weren't looking at their phones. They weren't talking. They were staring directly up at her second-floor window. Panic, cold and sharp, flared in her chest. She had humiliated a mob boss, or saved him. The line between the two was dangerously thin, and men like DeJuan Marshall didn't like owing debts to anyone, especially not to girls who served them appetizers. She had 10 seconds to decide whether to run down the fire escape or walk out the front door. Nadine looked back at the pink utility bill. If they wanted her dead, she wouldn't have woken up this morning. 10 minutes later, she walked out of the apartment building wearing her only decent pair of jeans and a faded grey sweater. The taller of the 2 men opened the rear door of the SUV. He didn't speak. He just waited. Nadine climbed inside. The leather seats smelled like expensive leather and ozone. The drive took 45 minutes, winding away from the gritty urban decay of the city out toward the coastal cliffs. The Marshall estate was a fortress of limestone and reinforced glass, entirely secluded from the main highway by wrought-iron gates and ancient oak trees. Nadine was escorted through the heavy mahogany front doors, past a sweeping staircase, and down a long, quiet corridor lined with abstract art that probably cost more than her life insurance policy. The man knocked once on a set of double oak doors and pushed them open. "Miss Walker, boss." The guard rumbled, stepping back to let her pass. The doors clicked shut behind her. DeJuan's office was immense, dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the churning grey water of the Atlantic. The room was aggressively minimalist. No clutter, no weakness. DeJuan sat behind a massive desk carved from a single slab of dark walnut. Today, he wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He wore a crisp white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing a sprawl of dark, intricate ink winding up his left forearm. He looked rested, dangerous, and completely in control. The vulnerable, bleeding man from the altar was entirely gone. He didn't look up from the leather-bound ledger he was writing in. "Sit down, Nadine." Nadine didn't move toward the plush guest chairs. She stood firmly in the center of the Persian rug. "I prefer to stand." DeJuan paused. He slowly capped his silver fountain pen and laid it precisely parallel to the ledger. He looked up. His hazel eyes were sharp, calculating, dissecting her in a single sweep. "Suit yourself," he said, his voice a low, smooth baritone. He leaned back in his chair. "You caused quite a stir last night. The Rossi family left the estate in a rage. Camilla's father is demanding an immediate renegotiation of our territorial boundaries." "That sounds like a you problem," Nadine said flatly. "I just poured the water." A dangerous, quiet amusement flickered in his eyes. "You did a little more than that. You broke ranks. You touched a Maid man without permission. In my world, hands have been broken for less." Nadine crossed her arms. "So you bought my employer and dragged me out of my apartment to break my hands. Seems like an expensive way to throw a tantrum." DeJuan didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet power in the room was absolute. I bought the company because I don't like loose ends. And I brought you here because I have a problem, and surprisingly, you are the solution." He hit a button on his desk. The quiet hum of an electric motor sounded as his wheelchair backed away from the desk, rotating smoothly to face her entirely. He wasn't hiding the chair. He was forcing her to look at it, daring her to show a flinch of the pity that she had refused to give him last night. "Sit down, Nadine." Dejuan repeated the command, slicing through the air like a blade. "We are going to negotiate." Nadine hesitated, then walked over to the leather chair opposite his desk and sat down. The leather was too soft, making her feel as though she were sinking, trapped. She forced her spine straight. "Negotiate what?" she asked. "I don't have anything you want." Dejuan rested his elbows on the armrests of his chair, steepling his fingers together. "That is where you are wrong. You have exactly what I need right now. A total lack of fear." He wheeled himself slightly closer, closing the distance between them. "My empire relies on perception," Dejuan stated calmly, as if discussing the weather and not a criminal syndicate. The moment Camilla ran, the perception shifted. The wolves smelled blood. "The Rossis think I'm weak. My own lieutenants are anxious. A boss who cannot secure his own wife is a boss who cannot secure his territory." "Then find someone else to marry," Nadine said. "You have money. Buy a bride who won't run. Anyone I buy from another family comes with strings." Dejuan shot back, his tone hardening. "They come with spies, agendas, and fathers who want a piece of my docks. I don't need a Mafia princess. I need a woman who belongs to no one. Someone who stands beside me in public, wears my ring, and reminds my enemies that I do not need their daughters to build my legacy." Nadine stared at him. The silence in the office stretched, broken only by the muffled crashing of the waves against the cliffs outside. "You want me to play your fake fiancé," she said, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated skepticism. "Mr. Marshall, that is the plot of a terrible romantic comedy. I have a degree in accounting that I can't afford to finish, and a landlord threatening eviction. I don't have time to play dress-up for the mob. $20,000 a month," Dejuan said smoothly. Nadine choked on her next breath. The number hit her like a physical blow. She blinked her mind instantly, fracturing into the math. 20,000. That was her rent for a year. That was her tuition. That was the crushing weight of her mother's medical debt, wiped clean in a matter of months. She dug her fingernails into the palms of her hands to stop them from shaking. "You're serious? I do not make jokes about money, Nadine. You will move into this estate. You will accompany me to dinners, galas, and sit-downs with the families. You will wear the clothes my tailor provides. You will smile for the cameras, and you will look at me like a woman who chose to be there, not a woman who was bought." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers, intense and unyielding. "Most importantly, you will never look at me with pity. That is the one term of this contract that is non-negotiable. The moment you look at me, the way those people looked at me in the church, our arrangement is terminated." Nadine's heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was standing at the edge of a precipice. Below her was a world of violence, blood, and men who killed over insults. But behind her was the crushing, suffocating reality of poverty. The pink utility bills, the empty fridge, and the danger. Nadine asked, her voice dropping to a quiet, serious register. "You're at war. If I stand next to you, I become a target." Dejuan's expression shifted. The cold, calculating boss vanished for a fraction of a second, replaced by something fierce and territorial. "You will have a security detail on you 24 hours a day. No one touches what is mine. The Rossis are cowards. They strike at reputations, not heavily guarded convoys. I will keep you safe. Like you kept your actual fiancé safe." The words left her mouth before she could stop them. De Juan's jaw clamped shut. A muscle feathered wildly in his cheek. He didn't yell. He didn't reach for a weapon. He just stared at her with a look that could strip the paint off the walls. Camilla was not in danger, he said, his voice dangerously soft. Camilla was simply disgusted. She found the prospect of a disabled husband unpalatable. Nadine watched him. The rawness of his admission hung heavy in the room. He was daring her to flinch, daring her to offer an apology or a platitude. She gave him neither. "Fine," Nadine said abruptly. De Juan blinked, the tension snapping. "Fine. 20,000 a month. But I have my own terms," Nadine said, leaning forward in the oversized chair matching his posture. "One, I get an advance today to clear my debts. 2, my bedroom has a lock on it that you don't have the key to. 3, I am an employee, not a servant. If your men disrespect me, you handle it. And 4, she paused, looking directly at the intricate tattoos on his forearm, then up to his sharp, guarded eyes. I don't sleep with you." De Juan let out a harsh, abrupt laugh. It echoed loudly in the cavernous office. "Don't flatter yourself, Nadine. I am hiring a shield, not a bedmate. My pride requires a public display, not private charity." "Good," Nadine said, ignoring the sting of his words. She stood up. "Do we have a deal?" De Juan looked at her. Really looked at her. She was wearing cheap clothes, she had bags under her eyes, and she was entirely out of her depth. Yet she was the only person in 48 hours who had looked him in the eye without a trace of fear or sympathy. He reached into the top drawer of his desk, pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills bound in a rubber band, and tossed it onto the walnut surface. "Welcome to the Marshall family, Nadine." The $20,000 cleared Nadine's bank account on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, her mother's medical debts were zeroed out. Her landlord was paid 6 months in advance, and she was standing in the center of a massive, sunlit dressing room in the east wing of the Marshall estate, stripped down to a slip. A frail-looking man named Julian — wait, no, Julian is a forbidden name. A frail-looking man named Arthur circled her with a tape measure. He smelled like peppermint and starch. 2 assistants hovered near the doorway, holding garment bags that probably cost more than Nadine's entire college tuition. "Shoulders back," Arthur murmured around a mouthful of pins. "You carry tension in your spine. It makes the silk bunch at the collar. I carry tension because there are 4 armed men standing outside the door," Nadine replied flatly. Arthur didn't smile. "Silk does not care about your personal anxieties, Miss Walker. It only cares about gravity." De Juan had not exaggerated the scope of her new employment. She was not a guest. She was a heavily guarded asset. Since moving into the estate, she had quickly learned that the Mafia did not operate like a movie set. It operated like a military base obsessed with paranoia. There were shift changes, security sweeps, and an endless stream of grim-faced men walking down the halls, talking into earpieces. The door to the dressing room clicked open. De Juan wheeled himself in, followed closely by Leo. Nadine crossed her arms instinctively, suddenly hyper-aware of the thin material of her slip. De Juan didn't look away, nor did he leer. He observed her with the same detached, clinical scrutiny he had used on the ledger in his office. "Arthur," De Juan said, stopping his chair near a velvet ottoman. "Progress. She has good posture when she remembers she isn't invisible," Arthur mumbled, pulling a tape measure taut across Nadine's waist. "But she favors practical shoes. We will have to train her to walk in the heels." "No stilettos," Nadine interrupted. Leo raised an eyebrow. Arthur sighed, dropping his hands. De Juan tilted his head, waiting for the explanation. I am a fake fiancé in the middle of a turf war, Nadine said, looking directly at De Juan. If someone starts shooting, I need to be able to run. I can't sprint in 4-inch heels. Put me in sensible wedges or flats, or I wear my boots. Leo let out a short, surprised bark of laughter. He quickly coughed to cover it up, looking away. De Juan's expression remained impassive, but the hard lines around his mouth softened marginally. Give her the block heels, Arthur. The lady wants to be combat ready. Arthur waved a hand dismissively. Barbaric, but fine. Let us try the evening gown for tomorrow night. The assistant stepped forward. They unzipped a thick black bag and pulled out a dress. It wasn't a princess gown. It was deep bruised crimson, made of a heavy fabric that looked like it could stop a knife. It was entirely unembellished. No lace, no sequins. Just a stark, severe cut that screamed wealth. They helped Nadine slip it on. The fabric weighed heavily against her skin, clinging to her ribs and falling straight to the floor. It felt like putting on a uniform. Nadine turned to the floor-to-ceiling mirror. She barely recognized the woman staring back. The exhaustion was still there, stamped into the faint purple shadows under her eyes. But the cheapness was gone. The desperation was hidden beneath layers of masterfully tailored fabric. She looked untouchable. Tomorrow night is the quarterly dinner with the capos, De Juan said quietly. He had rolled closer, his reflection joining hers in the glass. The stark white of his dress shirt contrasted sharply with the deep red of her gown. It is a tradition. Every quarter, the top earners gather at a neutral location to discuss business. Wives and fiancés are expected to attend. To show that everything is normal, Nadine concluded, not breaking eye contact with his reflection. Exactly. Victor will be there. Leo stepped into the frame of the mirror, his face grim. Victor manages the commercial ports. He's old blood, traditional. He was very loud about his disapproval when the Rossi girl ran. He thinks Dom looks weak. He thinks the territory is vulnerable. Victor is a shark, De Juan corrected smoothly, his voice dropping an octave. He will smell blood in the water. He will test you, Nadine. He will try to find the cracks in the story. He wants to know if you are a gold digger, a hostage, or a fool. What do I tell him? Nadine asked. De Juan turned his chair, breaking the mirrored stare to look at her directly. You tell him nothing. You don't explain yourself to a subordinate. You sit next to me. You wear the ring. You let him project whatever fears he has onto you. Silence is a weapon, Nadine. Use it. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He tossed it lightly. Nadine caught it with one hand. She opened the lid. Inside rested a diamond ring. It wasn't gaudy, but it was heavy. A square-cut emerald, surrounded by diamonds on a platinum band. It belonged to my grandmother. De Juan said, his tone entirely devoid of sentimentality. It signals permanence. Put it on. Nadine took the ring out of the box. The metal was cold. She slid it onto her left ring finger. It fit perfectly. Arthur's doing, no doubt. Tomorrow you stop being Nadine the caterer, De Juan said, his hazel eyes locking onto hers with terrifying intensity. Tomorrow you are Nadine Marshall. If Victor steps out of line, I will handle it. But you must not flinch. Nadine looked down at the heavy stone on her hand. It felt like a handcuff. But then she thought of the zero balance on her mother's hospital bills. I don't flinch, Mr. Marshall, she said calmly. I survive. The restaurant was downtown, occupying the entire penthouse floor of a high-rise. It was an establishment that didn't have prices on the menus. The lighting was low, the acoustics designed to swallow conversation, and the waitstaff moved like ghosts. De Juan and Nadine arrived in a convoy of 3 black SUVs. The logistics of the arrival were precise and entirely unromantic. The security detail swept the rear entrance. The hydraulic ramp lowered from the back of the modified vehicle. De Juan rolled himself out his face, a mask of absolute, terrifying calm. Nadine walked beside him. Her block heels clicked softly on the concrete of the underground garage. She wore the crimson dress and a black wool coat draped over her shoulders. The air was freezing, but she forced herself not to shiver. They took the private elevator up. The silence inside the steel box was heavy. De Juan stared straight ahead at the brass doors. Nadine watched his hands. They were resting loosely on his thighs, but the knuckles were white. "It's just a dinner," Nadine said quietly. "It is never just a dinner," De Juan replied, not looking at her. "Victor will have arranged the seating. He will have placed himself at the opposite end of the table, attempting to establish an equal footing. There will be a step up to the private dining room. 3 inches. Enough to force my men to lift the chair, completely shattering the illusion of independence, right at the door." Nadine looked at him. The sheer, exhausting calculus of his life hit her suddenly. He wasn't just fighting a turf war. He was fighting a war against architecture, against gravity, against the pity of his own men. The elevator pinged. The doors slid open. The maitre d' bowed deeply, his eyes darting nervously to the armed men stepping out behind them. "Mr. Marshall, right this way." They were led through the main dining room. The ambient chatter immediately died. Diners lowered their forks. Eyes tracked the wheelchair as it glided silently over the plush carpet. De Juan ignored them. He projected an aura of complete boredom, the apex predator walking through a petting zoo. They reached the entrance to the private dining room. Just as De Juan had predicted, there was a raised wooden threshold. A 3-inch lip. Inside the room, 12 men in expensive suits sat around a long, polished mahogany table. At the far end sat Victor. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 60s, with slicked-back silver hair and a face carved out of granite. He watched the doorway with hooded eyes, waiting for the inevitable humiliation of the boss needing help over a bump in the floor. Leo stepped forward immediately, his hands reaching for the back handles of De Juan's chair, to tilt it back. "Stop," Nadine said. Her voice wasn't loud, but the absolute lack of hesitation made Leo freeze. Everyone in the room looked at her. Nadine didn't look at Victor. She didn't look at the capos. She stepped directly in front of the threshold, blocking the view from the table. She turned to the maitre d', who was sweating profusely. "This is a fire hazard," Nadine said flatly, her voice carrying easily into the silent room. The maitre d' blinked. Excuse me, madam. A raised threshold without a transition strip in a commercial dining space violates municipal fire codes." Nadine continued drawing on her brief, miserable stint working as an admin for a real estate firm. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the wooden step. "If a server trips while carrying hot plates, you're looking at a massive liability suit. Have maintenance remove it by tomorrow. For tonight, bring the service ramp from the kitchen." The maitre d' stammered. I don't know if we—" "Bring the ramp," Nadine said, dropping her voice to a dead, icy register that sent a chill down Leo's spine. "Now!" The maitre d' practically sprinted away. Within 60 seconds, 2 busboys hurried over with a heavy-duty rubber wedge used for rolling delivery carts. They set it against the threshold and scurried away. Nadine stepped aside. She looked at De Juan. He was staring at her, his hazel eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something sharp, bright, and dangerously close to awe. He didn't say a word. He engaged the joystick, rolling smoothly up the ramp and into the room under his own power. No lifting, no tilting. No help from his soldiers. Nadine followed him, pulling her shoulders back, the heavy red silk rustling around her ankles. They took their places at the head of the table. The tension in the room was suffocating. Victor's face had darkened slightly. His trap had been bypassed by a woman he didn't even know. "Victor," De Juan said, smoothly steepling his fingers on the table. "You look well." "Boss." Victor grunted, his eyes sliding to Nadine. He didn't bother hiding his disdain. "We were surprised to hear about the new arrangement." Things moved quickly after the Rossi girl realized what she was signing up for. The insult was barely veiled. Several men around the table stiffened. Leo dropped his hand below the table, likely resting it on his holster. De Juan's jaw ticked, but before he could speak, Nadine picked up the heavy crystal decanter of red wine in the center of the table. She poured a glass for De Juan, then poured one for herself. She set the decanter down with a soft, final clink. "Camilla Rossi realized she was a coward," Nadine said into the dead silence of the room. She picked up her glass, swirling the dark liquid slowly. She looked directly down the length of the table, locking eyes with Victor. She didn't glare. She just looked incredibly bored. "She wanted a fairy tale. I prefer a man who actually runs his city. I hear the commercial ports were up 8% this quarter, Victor. You must be very relieved to have a boss who keeps the feds off your back while you count the shipments." Victor's mouth opened, then snapped shut. To insult De Juan's physical state was a gamble. To have a woman casually redirect the conversation to his earning metrics, reminding him exactly who signed his paychecks, was a complete checkmate. If he argued, he looked petty. If he agreed, he submitted. "The ports are secure," Victor muttered, finally picking up his water glass and looking away. The collective exhale in the room was almost audible. Dinner commenced. The conversation shifted to union disputes, shipping manifests, and bribes for the local alderman. Nadine ate her steak in silence. She didn't try to add to the conversation. She had fired her single bullet, and it had hit the center of the target. She was the wall between De Juan and the pity of his own men. 2 hours later, they were back in the armored SUV, speeding down the coastal highway toward the estate. The divider window between them and the driver was raised. The back seat was completely silent. Nadine leaned her head against the cold glass of the window, watching the blur of the ocean in the moonlight. The adrenaline was leaving her system, replaced by a deep, hollow exhaustion. "Fire codes," De Juan said, quietly into the darkness. Nadine didn't turn her head. "I used to process insurance claims for a slumlord. You pick things up." She heard the soft rustle of his suit jacket as he shifted in his seat. "You didn't have to do that," De Juan said. The sharp, commanding edge of the boss was gone. His voice was low, stripped bare. "With Victor, I am capable of defending my own honor." "I know," Nadine replied, finally turning to look at him. The shadows of passing streetlights cut across his face, highlighting the deep exhaustion he constantly tried to hide. "But you're tired of doing it. I'm just earning my paycheck, Mr. Marshall. You paid for a shield. I'm shielding." De Juan looked at her for a long time. The space between them in the wide back seat felt suddenly charged, the sterile transaction of their arrangement bleeding at the edges. "De Juan," he said softly. Nadine frowned. "What? If we are going to do this," he said, holding her gaze, "you have to stop calling me Mr. Marshall. My name is De Juan." Nadine looked down at the heavy emerald ring on her hand, then back up to the ruthless king sitting in the dark beside her. "Okay, De Juan." Sleep rarely visited the east wing of the Marshall estate. When it did, it was shallow and fractured. At 3 a.m, Nadine gave up on the illusion of rest. She kicked off the heavy down comforter, pulled a faded grey sweatshirt over her tank top and padded barefoot out of her bedroom. The sprawling corridors were cast in deep shadow, illuminated only by the faint security-grade blue lights spaced along the baseboards. The silence of the house was absolute heavy with the suffocating weight of 24-hour surveillance. She headed toward the kitchen for water, but a sliver of yellow light spilling from the ajar doors of the library stopped her. Nadine pushed the heavy oak door open just an inch. De Juan was not in his wheelchair. He was sitting on the edge of a low, tufted leather sofa in the center of the room. His chair was parked a few feet away, just slightly out of arm's reach. He wore dark track pants and a grey t-shirt sticking to his chest with sweat. He had both hands clamped around his right thigh, his knuckles stark white under the lamplight, his head bowed. His breathing was ragged, squeezed out through clenched teeth. On the glass coffee table in front of him sat a bottle of prescription nerve blockers, completely ignored. Nadine didn't gasp. She didn't retreat into the hallway to preserve his pride. She stepped into the room and closed the door behind her with a definitive click. De Juan's head snapped up. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and wildly feral. He looked like a cornered animal realizing its trap was closed. He let go of his leg instantly, his hands dropping to the sofa cushions, bracing his torso. "Get out!" he rasped. The command lacked its usual lethal edge. It sounded gutted. Nadine walked across the Persian rug. The plush wool was soft against her bare feet. "Are the pills not working?" "I said, get out, Nadine." De Juan's jaw locked. A violent tremor ran through his right leg, a cruel mockery of movement. It was a spasm, chaotic and entirely out of his control. He stared at the wall, refusing to look at her, his chest heaving. "This is not part of the contract." "Neither is me pretending I don't live in this house," Nadine replied flatly. She bypassed the sofa entirely and walked to the small wet bar tucked into the corner of the library. She grabbed a heavy crystal tumbler, filled it with tap water, and walked back. She set the glass on the table right next to the pill bottle. Then she sat down on the opposite end of the leather sofa. She didn't look at his trembling leg. She looked at the dark, storm-tossed ocean raging outside the window. "Phantom pain?" she asked quietly. "Nerve damage." De Juan corrected the words, grinding like stones in his throat. He reached for the glass, his hand shaking slightly before he steadied it. He drank the water in one long pull. "The spinal cord is severed, but the nerves below the injury misfire. My brain registers it as my legs being held over an open flame." Nadine kept her eyes on the window. "How often?" "Often enough to remind me I'm still alive. Not often enough to kill me." The stark brutality of his reality hung in the air. This was the man who ruled a city, the man who terrified capos and commanded an army. Stripped of his suits and his titanium armor, he was just a man fighting a war inside his own nervous system, utterly alone in the dark. "When my mother was dying," Nadine said, her voice entirely devoid of sentimentality. Her kidneys failed. The toxins built up in her blood. She used to claw at her own arms because she said her skin felt like it was covered in fiberglass. I couldn't fix it. I just had to sit there and watch her bleed from scratching. De Juan turned his head. He looked at her profile, the harsh lines of exhaustion etched around her mouth. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because I'm not going to coddle you," Nadine said, finally turning to meet his gaze. "I'm not Camilla. I don't need you to be a flawless king on a throne. You're in pain. It sucks. I'm sitting here until it stops." De Juan stared at her. The feral panic in his eyes slowly dissolved, replaced by a profound, heavy silence. He didn't ask her to leave again. He leaned his head back against the leather sofa, closing his eyes. The tremor in his leg continued, but the suffocating tension in the room began to fracture. For 20 minutes they sat in silence. Nadine didn't offer a platitude. De Juan didn't offer an apology. They simply existed in the quiet, shared space of endurance. Then the world exploded. A concussive blast shattered the quiet, violently shaking the floorboards. The heavy window panes bowed inward before the reinforced glass caught the shockwave. Instantly, the blue baseboard lights snapped off, replaced by the violent, strobing red flash of the perimeter breach alarm. An automated siren began to wail a deafening mechanical scream. De Juan's eyes flew open. The exhaustion was instantly eradicated, replaced by pure, crystallized adrenaline. Gunfire, heavy automatic fire echoing from the front gates, cracked through the night air. "Rossis!" De Juan snarled. The heavy library door was kicked open. Leo stood in the threshold, an assault rifle already strapped across his chest, a tactical flashlight sweeping the dark room. Boss front gate is gone. 3 SUVs rammed the barricade. We have multiple hostiles on the lawn. They're making a hard push for the main doors. "Safe room," De Juan ordered his voice, cutting through the siren like a knife. He shifted his weight, grabbing the armrest of his wheelchair, pulling himself forward to transfer. But the nerve spasm from earlier had left his upper body strained. His palm slipped on the leather of the sofa. He began to fall backward. Nadine moved without thinking. She didn't hesitate, and she didn't ask permission. She stepped directly into his space, grabbing the thick fabric of his track pants at the hip with one hand and wrapping her other arm firmly around his back, under his shoulder blade. "Push!" she commanded, her voice dropping all pretense of deference. De Juan didn't argue. He used her solid grip as an anchor, pushing off the sofa with his left arm, while she hauled his dead weight upward and pivoted his torso. It wasn't graceful. It was a desperate, heavy collision of bodies. But in 3 seconds, he was seated firmly in his chair. He looked up at her, breathing hard. Nadine didn't step back. "Let's go," she said. The safe room was a reinforced concrete bunker beneath the east wing, accessible through a concealed service elevator in the floor of the study. The heavy steel door sealed shut with a pneumatic hiss, cutting off the wail of the alarms and the sharp crack of rifle fire above. Inside, the air was cold and smelled faintly of copper and dust. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered to life, illuminating metal racks of ammunition communication arrays and a small cot in the corner. Leo was above ground, coordinating the defense. Down here, it was just the two of them. Nadine wrapped her arms around her chest. The adrenaline was crashing out of her system, leaving her shivering violently in her thin sweatshirt. She stared at the blank steel door, her mind desperately trying to process the fact that men with guns were currently trying to murder them. De Juan wheeled himself to the communication console, flipping a series of switches. Static hissed into the room, followed by the clipped shouted orders of his men over the radio frequencies. "They haven't breached the house," De Juan said, reading the tactical display. "It's a suicide run. The Rossis are trying to prove they aren't afraid of the territory lines. They're sending a message, not an assassination squad." He turned his chair to look at Nadine. She was standing perfectly still in the center of the bunker, barefoot on the cold concrete. She looked small. She looked entirely out of place in a room built for war. A sharp, unfamiliar ache twisted in De Juan's chest. It wasn't nerve pain. It was guilt, pure, toxic, and paralyzing. He had brought a civilian, a girl who worried about utility bills and polyester uniforms, into a kill box just to salvage his own pride. He reached out and hit a button on the console, muting the radio chatter. The bunker fell completely silent. "The contract is void," De Juan said. Nadine blinked, pulling her gaze away from the steel door. "What? You heard me?" De Juan's voice was completely devoid of emotion. He was locking down, retreating behind the impenetrable armor of the boss. As soon as Leo secures the perimeter, I am having a team transport you to a safe house in upstate New York. I will wire the remaining 11 months of your salary to your account by sunrise. You're done. Nadine's shivering stopped. A slow, hot wave of anger began to pool in her stomach. You can't fire me. I didn't break a single rule. I am breaking the rules, De Juan snapped. He rolled his chair forward, closing the distance between them. His hazel eyes were hard, pushing her away with lethal force. You almost caught a bullet tonight, Nadine. If they had breached the library 2 minutes earlier, you would be dead. I bought a shield, not a martyr. I don't need your blood on my floor. I knew the risks when I took the money. Nadine shot back, lifting her chin, refusing to step away from him. You didn't know anything. De Juan roared, the sound bouncing violently off the concrete walls. You are an accountant. You cater weddings. You have no concept of what it means to live in a world where a weak moment gets you slaughtered. I am a cripple, leading a syndicate of wolves. They will keep coming for me, and if you are standing next to me, they will tear you apart, just to watch me bleed. He was breathing heavily, the raw truth of his existence laid bare under the harsh lights. He wasn't pushing her away out of arrogance. He was pushing her away because he was terrified for her. Nadine looked at him. She looked at the tattoos on his arms, the exhaustion lining his eyes, the heavy titanium frame that anchored him to the earth. She took a step forward. De Juan stiffened. Nadine, don't... She didn't stop. She took another step, placing herself directly between his knees. She reached down and took both of his hands. They were cold, trembling slightly from the adrenaline. She gripped them tightly, lacing her fingers through his. Stop trying to manage me, Nadine said, her voice dropping to a fierce, steady whisper. I am not a liability. I am not Camilla. I don't care about the money anymore, and I am not running. De Juan stared up at her, entirely disarmed. Why? He asked, the word fracturing in his throat. Why would you stay? Because you're not a cripple to me. De Juan, she said, squeezing his hands. You're just a man who gets on my nerves, a man who doesn't know how to sleep, and the only man I've ever met who actually sees me. She let go of his hands and moved her palms up to frame his jaw. His skin was rough with stubble, his jaw tight. He didn't pull away. He leaned into her touch, a microscopic surrender that felt heavier than the concrete ceiling above them. The Rossis want a war, Nadine asked, her thumb brushing over his cheekbone. Let them have it, but you don't fight it alone, not anymore. De Juan reached up his large hand, wrapping around her wrist. He didn't remove her hand from his face. He held it there, anchoring himself to the steady, grounded reality of her pulse. Above them, the muffled sounds of gunfire ceased. The radio crackled to life, Leo's voice breaking through the static to confirm the hostiles were neutralized and the grounds were secure. De Juan didn't look at the radio. He kept his eyes locked on Nadine. The king hadn't just found his queen. He had found his equal. And tomorrow the rest of the city was going to find out exactly what happened when you fired shots at the only thing De Juan Marshall truly cared about. Did this opening hook you? The world of De Juan and Nadine is just beginning. What happens when a ruthless king finds his pride rescued by a maid with absolutely nothing to lose? Will Nadine survive the violent politics of the Marshall family? And can De Juan protect the only person who saw the man behind the wheelchair? Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video to support the story. Drop a comment below with your predictions for Part 4. We want to hear your theories.